Well, the temperature plunged as I left the sunshine and the palm trees and entered the local ice skating rink here in San Diego. The temperature really plummeted quite dramatically from outside to where I could see my breath. That was refreshing. And it's at that very moment that I spotted her there on white figure skates. A young woman with a sweatshirt, and across the sweatshirt were the words, "spiritually exhausted." Now, not every one of us would be so candid about how we were feeling or perceiving the world. But there it was, and whether we would choose to wear that particular shirt, I suspect that at some level or another, each of us can identify with her. I happen to know this young woman. I've spoken with her, and I've discovered that the reason for her sense of spiritual depletion is the day-to-day drain of her day-in, day-out daily grind. It's taxed her, and she feels this. And what she's talking about is not just the kind of normal fatigue you get from working long hours. That problem can be addressed usually by taking some breaks, or getting a good night's sleep, or maybe even a vacation getaway. But we're talking about something that's deeper and more persistent and hard to deal with. Sometimes we're almost overwhelmed by the sense of the futility of it all. And perhaps the words of that Shakespeare soliloquy from Macbeth comes into our minds. Life's a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. What would it take to turn this all around? What would it take to move back into an experience of rejuvenation and revitalization in our workday experience? We live in a messy world. Perhaps it's asking too much to even hope for such a thing. But I believe that it is possible. I believe that there is a way to find that spiritual rejuvenation. But the solution is going to require more than just going out and trying to find another better job. It's going to require an inner reorientation to our work lives. We need a spirituality that can re-energize us in our work. And if we're going to get there, we need to rethink the story from the Bible about Mary and Martha. Indeed, this has probably been the story that has evoked the most reflection about work. You will probably remember it well. Jesus and his entourage have visited the home of these sisters, Mary and Martha. And while Martha is engaged in frenzied preparations, Mary sits by Jesus' feet and takes in everything he has to say. And in her fluster, Martha takes exception and complains to Jesus about her sister's indolence. And we're all familiar with the response that Jesus gives in validating Mary's side. Mary has chosen the better part, Jesus says. And from that story, you see, the historic Christian tradition has jumped to the assumption that the contemplative life is always superior to the active life. And what this is really about is telling us that it's better to do your devotions than to engage in productive work. That's the message we've gotten from this text. And early Christianity flourished in an environment where Platonic philosophy was profoundly influential in the culture. And that Platonic philosophy only tended to reinforce this prejudice against the sphere of action and industry and a preference for contemplation, devotion, and prayer. That's continuing to be the way we tend to see things in the church today. And yet at the same time, a lot of us feel a certain sympathy for Martha in that story and wonder if she wasn't rebuked just a little harshly for all her good endeavors at that time. We feel a little ambivalent about the conclusion we reach so quickly in that story. And I've got a little poem I want to share with you that may help us as we reassess this story from the New Testament. Let's look at that now. It's written from Martha's perspective. Our whole lives I have grounded her, been the roof separating her from the sky. She could spend hours dreaming her way to the well, clay jug waiting to be filled. They say now that I was wrong, that while I braided the bread, my sister's undone hair was her salvation. I stood in the doorway, watching her anoint his feet, perfume glazing my clean floor, and thought how badly they need us, the hands that pour for the lips that drink, the careful scaffolding for their irresponsible miracles. I think we can see more clearly that what that story of Mary and Martha is really teaching is that we mustn't live frenzied, preoccupied, distracted work lives that push Jesus to the very margins of our consciousness. That's what's being criticized here. But when we are able to integrate the spiritual attentiveness of Mary with the good endeavors of Martha, what we have in combination is holy work. Evelyn Underhill has said this about the spiritual life. She said, the spiritual life is simply a life in which all that we do comes from the center, where we are anchored in God. It's a life soaked through and through with a sense of His presence and claim. It's a life then self-given to the greater movement of His will. One of the key things in that definition of the spiritual life is it's about all that we do. And that umbrella encompasses certainly this huge chunk of all that we do, our working lives. The early church had a wonderful little two-word Latin phrase, Coram Deo, that summed up this kind of life we're describing. It means that we live all of our lives before God. Now, in a sense, all of our lives are already before God. We know that there's no way we can escape the all-seeing gaze of the all-knowing one. But to live our lives before God says something more. It means that we welcome His presence into our lives and endeavors. It means that we choose to stay in sync with His Spirit. It means that we are intentionally choosing what's been called the with God life. We make a conscious, continually reiterated resolve to keep company with God. This is the framework of making all our endeavors Coram Deo. One of my favorite statues is one that I discovered in southern Ontario some years ago at a retreat center. It's a life-size bronze statue of Ignatius of Loyola. And Ignatius is facing a stiff wind in his face. And he's wrapped his cloak around him just to keep it from tearing away in the wind. But what's so fascinating about this statue is that as he's leaning into the wind, his head is tilted a little to one side. You see, his ear is cocked because he's listening for the voice of the wind, which is, of course, a symbol of the Spirit of God. He is trying to hear the voice that will lead him forward. This is such a wonderful symbol of the with God life that we are invited to experience, each one of us. It's the beginning of adventure, for this very obvious reason, that when we experience this with God life, we are not just having comfortable companionship with a peer. We are in company with the very Lord of life. And this Lord of life, our new journey partner, has opinions on things. He leads, and we feel very acutely that we are no longer entirely in control. There is a loss of that control that we cherish. We are no longer entirely in charge of the trajectory of our careers. But the beauty of it is, we can make a choice between staying in the security we try to manufacture for ourselves, or exchanging that for the adventure He promises. Perhaps you're thinking, well, this all sounds very exciting, but I am an ordinary person. I am not exceptional. In retrospect, my life and career's work will be just a blip on the screen. Some years ago, I was attending the prestigious American Academy of Religion meetings, and a friend of mine who's a very good theologian, he's smarter than me, he writes faster, he's more sought after, and he was giving a talk at the Academy. And I decided to go along in support of him. And as we sat down and prepared for his presentation, I turned to the friend next to me and said, "That guy up there is a friend of mine." But as he began to talk, his comments, though they were brilliant, became strangely irritating to me. And I started to make sarcastic asides to this gentleman next to me, and kept this up as the talk went on. And finally he turned and he looked me right in the eye and he said, "Did you say that the speaker was your friend?" And it hit me, the conviction, like a shovel on the side of the head. And as soon as the session was over, I jumped up and I went right back to my hotel room, got down on my knees, and wept out my confession to God. You see, what had happened was my sense of inferiority had undermined my hope that I could have a useful life, because I wasn't as equipped and qualified as he was. The way out of that darkness was to grasp in a deeper way that my being unspectacular is not a problem to the God of purpose. And I take great comfort in the words of a poet who said, "With God, even the commonplace can be tinged with glory." I'm a skeptic by nature, so another question comes into my mind, and it's this: but what if nobody notices? What's the point of doing all this stuff if nobody notices? It's interesting to think of Jesus and his interest in the habits of the heart. What is it that drives us in our work? Is it meaning? Is it significance? These things have their place. But if we go back and probe the heart of the early Christians as witnessed in the New Testament, this is what we find. We find in the words of the Apostle Paul, we make it our aim to be pleasing to him. There's a certain freedom in living for that audience, ultimately, of one. With that comes a relative measure of freedom from the pressure to win the approval of peers. It helps us understand why Jonathan Edwards, this great American theologian, very early on in his illustrious career, was able to resolve that he would be, by God's grace, useful rather than conspicuous. Christianity is a realistic religion. We don't indulge in fantasies. And so we need to come to terms with the fact that work is going to continue to be hard. And we're going to make our way by the sweat of our brow. But I'm thinking of that young woman back in the ice rink, you remember? And the rest of us who are in some ways like her at times. What hope is there for us? The hope is not in picking between Mary and Martha, but in fusing together that attentiveness to God with the endeavor and resolve that Martha represented. And when those two things are together, we are able to understand that there is a spiritual life, there is a spirituality that can energize our work and sustain us. We have the opportunity to live into this adventure, which is so full of hope for ordinary people. And as we do, perhaps we can join our hearts with that of Thomas Ken when he wrote many years ago this prayer: direct, control, suggest this day all I design or do or say, that all my powers and all my might in thy sole glory may unite. Amen. And thank you.